Shawna Meek, a professional certified coach, specializes in supporting women experiencing betrayal trauma, particularly those in neurodiverse marriages with autism and Asperger's profiles. As the founder of Living Stone's coaching, mentoring, and consulting in Arizona, she authored the book Determined for More, reflecting her 25-year marriage journey with Kevin. Kevin Meek, also with Living Stones, mentors men struggling with problematic sexual behavior, especially those diagnosed with or considering autism ASD1, focusing on recovery and relationship growth. Together, they offer personalized, relatable support to clients internationally, guiding couples through healing, sexual integrity, and sobriety. Hi, Shawna and Kevin. It's so good to see you guys again. And thank you so much for being one of the presenters at the Neurodiverse Love Conference.
So glad to be here and be back having an enriching conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. I think I've told you guys this, but your episode of the Neurodiverse Love podcast is always in the top 3 out of 200 plus episodes that I've done. So what that says to me is that your story has really hit home for a lot of folks. I mean, thousands of people have listened to your story. And today you're going to talk about overcoming problematic sexual behavior and betrayal trauma in a neurodiverse relationship, which is part of your story and the work you do. And so I'm going to step back and let you guys do your thing, and your slides are going to come up, and then I'll come back at the end of your presentation.
Sounds great. Awesome. We'll see you soon. All right. Welcome, everybody that is here at the conference. We are thrilled to be here and just really feel passionate about so many things that are being shared in the conference. We were already hearing a lot of it. And today we wanted to talk to you about overcoming problematic sexual behavior and betrayal trauma, as Mona was talking about, while we're in a neurodiverse relationship.
A little bit about us. I know Mona's introduced us, but it's my wife, Shawna, and Shawna is an ICF certified professional coach, also a consultation supervisor, board member with APSATs and others, and a betrayal trauma coach is really where her passion is. And I'm her husband, Kevin. I am the neurodiverse in the relationship, and I have the privilege of getting to come alongside men as a peer mentor. Many years ago when we started our journey, we really struggled to find support and to find resources, especially like this. And so it's kind of emotional that we didn't have this. And so we're so grateful. And we just feel that this is a part of giving back and a part of coming alongside others that are maybe figuring this out for the first time or looking to see if maybe this is a fit for them. And we're just really excited to be here.
As we begin, just a couple things we wanted to just share. We just encourage you to stay open-minded about this consideration. We're going to be talking about kind of this intersection where problematic sexual behavior and betrayal trauma might intersect in a neurodiverse relationship. And so staying open-minded as we talk about this, considering this possibility, and then focusing on solutions. So we are not here to talk about the problem, even though it might be problematic in your relationship. We're really here to just open our minds and our hearts to this possibility and focus on those solutions. We're going to start with a couple questions and just kind of walk through some of the things as we think just at the beginning. How do most relationships often begin? And some of the things that were top of mind as we were talking about this are exclusivity. So most of the time we have a commitment to be with each other only. Now, some relationships might be a different version of that, but I would say most, not all, we're talking about exclusivity. We're coming into relationship expecting honesty, being forthright with one another, even when it hurts. Having a commitment, So usually we've said some promises or some vows or something, and staying through the hard and the ugly of a relationship. And often we have some agreements. Some are spoken. Maybe we have sexual agreements in the exclusivity. Maybe we have financial fidelity agreements that are more spoken, and some that are unspoken. Who's responsible for what? Who does what in the family? Who does what in the house? So those are just a few of the first things we wanted to start with. All right. How do many relationships rupture? So at a high level, this doesn't include everything, but we do want to kind of highlight some things that we see a lot. One is abandonment. So leaving the relationship suddenly, having, just that quick, abrupt, whether it's a permanent abandonment or even, smaller ruptures, abandonment. Abuse, so mistreatment of one or both partners. So it can be, one way, or it can be both, kind of in an abusive situation. That can be verbally, not just physically or sexually. There can be psychological abuse.
Yeah, and I think on these, oftentimes I think we fall to a stereotypical view, which is an extreme, right? When we think of abandonment, we think of someone that's just, they've left completely physically abandoned, right? But there's emotional abandonment as well. On the abuse side, that's such a word that those of us who have been the abuser, that's a hard pill to swallow. And so many times we minimize that, or maybe don't see that as abuse or call it abuse. And so it's not just the grand term of these that are a problem, but even the small parts of that as well.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. We're not going to talk a lot about abuse, but I did want to just say really quick before we move to the other elements is when we're thinking about that, we're not saying everybody with problematic sexual behavior or everybody in a neurodiverse relationship is abusive. We're just saying these are how relationships rupture. So I just kind of want to caveat these things because there could be other reasons for this. Disconnection. So a slow fade over time, right? Where the relationship, it's kind of like both partners kind of start departing. That sometimes can rupture a relationship. And then there's deception, when trust is broken through dishonesty. And that's really where we're going to be talking about most, is where that deception comes in. So how does deception affect the relationship? This is not a comprehensive list, but it's at a high level, and we think we're covering a lot of the things that can happen when deception impacts or affects a relationship. And sometimes it's when one person has power, when there is deception with problematic sexual behavior. So this can sometimes be both, but usually it's one person that is obtaining power in the form of problematic sexual behavior or hidden sexual behavior. And that's kind of our main point of discussion. Also, often those agreements and commitments have been broken without consent. So without saying, hey, can I go, outside of the marriage for this, or can I be looking at this thing, or can I be visiting this place? And I'm not going to get into the depth. Kevin will talk about that a little bit more, of the different types of problematic behavior we're referring to. Sometimes deception affects the relationship when it hits a sensitive part of the relationship, causing intimate partner betrayal. So in our story, and you can listen to the podcast Mona was referring to, we talk a lot about our story. And also in the book that I've written is even a longer version than a podcast could cover. But the intimate partner betrayal was something that I experienced due to Kevin's problematic sexual behavior. So great. Thank you. Also, it often creates betrayal trauma. And that might be a term that you're familiar with, or you may not be familiar with it yet. But that creates confusion, brain fog, ruminating thoughts. And a lot of times in betrayal trauma, we can get what are considered PTSD symptoms. So betrayal trauma isn't even a diagnosable code, nor is sex addiction in the United States. The World Health Organization has a broader, they're a little bit more advanced sometimes than the DSM, but the the PTSD symptoms that we're familiar with, clinically speaking, as well as, we just kind of hear that term. That is a lot of what betrayal trauma experiences are like. And I know I had a lot of those symptoms and had some complexity to my PTSD. Despair and disorientation of reality impacts the betrayed partner. So one of the things I like to say, it's like you just took someone's world and just flipped it upside down, and it creates this shock in the nervous system and a despair and disorienting of my safe person, someone that I thought was there for me. And wait, they're betraying me. He's hiding from me. There's deception and things that are happening. One other thing is how deception affects the relationship is ongoing shame and toxic guilt impacts the struggling partner. And sometimes the betrayed partner, I will say that. Sometimes the shame and toxic guilt, is this my fault? Did I cause this somehow? And that in both partners can be hard because we may already have some shame present in a neurodiverse relationship. I know for us, we didn't know about the neurodiversity when I found out about the betrayal. And so you add in those layers and kind of that intersection comes together, and what already might feel like we're so different as a couple. And now we've got this extra impact to the relationship. I'll let you take this one.
Yeah.
How's that?
So
Okay.
we've been talking a little bit about problematic sexual behavior, and I think we just want to take a second and just share what some of that might look like. So a few things that fall into that category might be a pornography addiction. And I think in today's society, this is probably one of the biggest places that we're seeing it. With that, it's excessive and often unmanageable obsession of pornographic material. And even that alone of what is pornographic can be so broad in that. But it leads to negative consequences. It leads to that deception. It leads to disconnection. It leads to a lot of the shame and guilt that Shawna was just talking about. And I think a lot of times with this, we think, well, it's not going to affect anyone. No one's going to be hurt by this. It's just going to affect me. And that's just not at all what we see. Self-fulfillment or pleasure. So this could be masturbation, causing personal and relational consequences. So it might be in place of sexual relationship. It might be, as a part of, and in some way it's creating those relational consequences and disconnection in the relationship. Emotional affairs. These are where we might be deeply emotionally connected with someone other than our partner. This could be same sex. It could be opposite sex. It could be any form of that can fall into the emotional affair category for that. On the next slide, we'll see a few more here around physical affairs. And that's often when that emotional affair maybe goes to the next step or the next level. It's intimate and sexual activity when with someone outside of your primary relationship. So back to what Shawna was talking about, the agreement and kind of the commitment that was set. It's when you break that and when you go outside of what that agreed upon arrangement is like. And then other compulsive sexually addictive behaviors could be prostitution, voyeurism, exhibitionism, objectification, and then acting out from fantasy. And so, again, as we mentioned, there's really a lot that go into this type of problematic sexual behavior category. But these are, I think, probably the most often ones that we see as we're working with couples and with those that are struggling.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say on that last point there, some of those words, before I was doing this work, I was like, I'm not quite sure. What do you mean by voyeurism or objectification or, big, a little more clinical words there. And so I just want to say that with a specialist helping, like if there are some compulsive things, obviously the word prostitution or hired, sex, paid for sex, we might hear that, voyeurism, peeping Tom, kind of invading people, offending people by, they're not in a consensual place to be observed or viewed or taped or recorded. That can be a lot of forms. Exhibitionism, displaying of, private areas in public and those sorts of things. Objectification, I will say the best way to describe that for me is, we're looking at people not as people, we're objectifying them as objects or parts of bodies versus as the whole person, and then acting out of fantasy. So that I like to say in the work that I do with both couples and the betrayed partner is sometimes that is an affair of the mind, playing that out. That can kind of include objectification at times, but playing that out for self-fulfillment, which the reason most of these are problematic is because of the self-focused and isolation that it causes in the relationship. So just wanted to add that.
Great. Awesome. So then we want to talk about how is repair possible? So if these ruptures that we talked about earlier occur, how is repair possible in the relationship? And it really starts with the struggling partner must take responsibility for the deception first. Often the lies and the withholding of the truth is the most painful part for the betrayed partner. It's that I trusted someone that I thought I could trust. It's not necessarily so much about maybe what they did as much as, wow, now I can't trust them. And if I can't trust them here, can I trust them anywhere? And is trust completely lost and gone? And, that's really where that becomes the most important thing initially for the struggling partner to really accept that responsibility for that. The struggling partner must then also choose recovery for the problematic behavior. They have to begin to say, yes, this is a problem, and begin to do the work and begin to navigate what recovery might look like for them. Then also the betrayed partner often finds professional support and community. I think one of the stigmas that we are trying to help break and get through is that this type of problematic sexual behavior happens in maybe lesser relationships, not strong relationships. Maybe they happen with, people that struggle financially or struggle. No, the problematic sexual behavior happens in any, there's no, it doesn't discriminate. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. It doesn't discriminate. It is from blue collar to white collar. It is from, white to African American. It is across the gamut. There is no discrimination from that. And so really being able to be open to that and share that and say, hey, you're not the only one. I think that is really that isolation component that Shawna mentioned is really where so many couples can stay stuck and where recovery really doesn't happen very well because it has to happen in community. And so that betrayed partner often finds support in community. And I'll say as well as the struggling partner finds that as they begin to work a program. Establishment of truth must be a priority. There has to be a therapeutically led disclosure. There has to be a baseline that we say, okay, I know that there's been deceit or deception in the past, but as of today, starting here, this point, that we can move forward, and then safety can begin to be built upon that. There has to be, if you think back to the analogy of a house and a foundation, right? When this happens, the foundation crumbles. It's not just a door is loose, like the foundation has crumbled. We have to rebuild that foundation with a bedrock of trust to then be able to build back the relationship.
I just wanted to say something there. You said you have to have that therapeutic-led disclosure. I want to say a lot of people don't. So if you're hearing this and you're like, oh my gosh, I did a DIY, which I did almost 15 years ago when I had his betrayal discovered. I sat with my laptop and typed away everything that he was telling me he did. That harmed me in a way that I was grateful that he was ready to tell me the truth, but I didn't know what I didn't know to ask or not ask. And so when you have someone, I think that's why we're passionate about that, is because we have had some harm in that. because then we're always going back for more questions versus can we kind of come together. We could have a whole nother talk on therapeutic-led disclosures, but I think the reality is creating that safety with those that understand and can guide you through that in a safe way, especially we will say for us in a neurodiverse relationship, because we had the extra complexity of already cross-wiring our communication, dysregulation. Well, I find this out and I am definitely dysregulated. He's already kind of elevated as it was in everyday life. We didn't have the tools we have now. And so I think that's why we're passionate about that and really having that safety. So,
and last point on that, Shawna had mentioned that she did a DIY. That was 16 years ago for our original
15,
discovery. And however, when I had a full neurodiverse meltdown and abandoned her just a couple of years ago, we then went through a therapeutic-led disclosure kind of update.
Just verifying truth.
Verification of truth.
I couldn't see the difference.
And we said as we went through that, man, I wish we had this then. So definitely.
And there really wasn't a lot in the field.
Right.
Now there's so much more support. There's also so much more support for neurodiverse couples and understanding those nuances. And when trauma is impacting the betrayal, it, becomes a trauma often. And then there could be trauma already underlying there. So,
great.
Yeah.
You want to take this one?
Do it.
Perfect. All right. So what about when neurodiversity is present? So this again adds an additional layer to the problematic sexual behavior, the betrayal, let's just call it that occurred. The problematic behavior must still be addressed first. So we got to kind of triage the situation, stop the bleeding. We have to stop that behavior to be able to then move to the next point, which would be then to the neurodiverse lens can support the struggling partner. We got to consider the characteristics and the traits that could divert recovery and healing. I know a lot of the guys that I'm able to mentor and come alongside, they may have been in or still in a recovery program or a sobriety recovery group that is geared more towards those that are neurodiverse, and they're struggling to find solid, stable sobriety and recovery. And part of that is when we're able to kind of bring that neurodiverse lens to it and not change everything that they're doing, not reinvent it, but to just kind of refocus that with a different lens, we're able to see some great success from that. And then finally, I've said this, if I've said it once, I've said it 100 times. Understanding that neurodiversity is not an excuse for the behaviors that cause harm in the relationship. It might be a part of it. It might be a challenge to it. It might be the struggle, but it doesn't get to be the excuse. I wish it did. It would be a lot easier for me. I wouldn't have to do the hard work. But the reality is we need to do the work. We cannot change our characteristics and our traits, but we can change our behavior. You have a great saying that you say to that. Remember what it is?
Spot. I might think of it.
All right, you think of it, but when you do, it's good. On the next slide, then we'll talk about what considerations can help the struggling partner. Really, the thing here that I work with a lot of the guys is to really know what our capacities are. Anxiety tolerance and limiting external stressors. So when we're engaging in our recovery work, when we're engaging in, those things that we need to be doing, where's the anxiety? Where do those external stressors start to come in? And what is our capacity as we work to re-engage and repair the relationship? Managing that sensory input with sound, light, smells, in recovery settings. So if we happen to go to a recovery group and, everybody goes out for a smoke break, or everybody comes in and the lights are, flashing in the room, or it's just really loud, those things can completely divert us in a recovery meeting because we get distracted from that. So manage those sensory inputs to get the most out of what you're there for. Understanding shame resilience level. Shawna spoke to this a little bit earlier. I know we've talked about that toxic shame versus healthy shame.
Mhm.
Know where our shame resilience level falls in there. Be able to recognize when we might be falling into toxic shame and kind of starting to divert the recovery efforts. Shifting our hyper focus to recovery healing versus the problematic behavior. Oftentimes, it's a 12-step program that we might go into. And I know for me, I went in with a hyper focus of great, 12 steps, I can do one a day, and in 12 days I'll be done, right? And really kind of going after the recovery. But having that opportunity to have something that is positive to focus on rather than the problematic behavior really is essential for that. On the next slide, we have a few more that kind of go into areas of focus that we can really kind of drill into. These are for kind of the more neurodiverse areas within our relationship. So focusing on receptive and expressive communication, focusing on how we say it, nonverbal and verbal, focusing on how we receive it, listening to that feedback that comes in, not turning on our defense mechanisms and going into enemy mode. All of those things are so important. Expanding our theory of mind. Boy,
I have a feeling there's going to be some great conversations at this conference about that.
If that was not something that was easy to do, we probably wouldn't need the conference, right? But really taking that time, using the tools, using those podcasts and things to expand that theory of mind. Problem-solving abilities and solution-minded. So again, getting to solutions, not getting stuck on the problems. And then reducing our PDA, or that pervasive demand avoidance, which is, again, one of the traits that kind of can come with autism for those of us that may have PDA as a kind of more prominent characteristic trait. But I'll say it again, those are not excuses for us. They may just be challenges that we need to overcome.
So before we go to the next slide, I don't remember the quote, but I'm racking my brain. But here's the gist of it. When I think about it in like characteristics and traits that we have, let's say for you, I'll use you as an example. But we have characteristics and traits as an ASD1 individual. And those we may be able to adapt. We want to get to know those characteristics and traits. Then we have our emotional states of being, and those impact then our behaviors, right? Our coping behaviors, what we do with that. So if I think about that, I'll give you the whole quote, but basically that's the gist of it, of, understanding our characteristics and traits, adjusting those emotional states, and being responsible and taking responsibility for the behaviors that then result from that. So they're separate, but can roll into the next. So, okay.
Love it.
All right. Next, we'll go to what does the betrayed partner often need? So recognition of ownership. So for me, hearing things like, this is my responsibility and my problem, this isn't a relational problem, his acting out outside the marriage, I didn't consent to that. That was not mine. I didn't say that was okay with me. So him taking that and saying, this is my responsibility. I know we're talking about problem solving, but this is something that's caused destruction. So that's really, I think, a really powerful place for someone to start, rather than saying it's a we problem, because it really wasn't, and it often isn't. There's usually underlying things that have required this coping strategy. Remorse for the hurt and pain. I hear how much I've hurt you. Now, this might be remorse in a sense of like a cognitive empathy. Maybe it's not an emotional empathy, because that is a challenge. But I think still saying, I hear you say, repeat back. I hear you say how much this has hurt you.
Yeah. I think an important word there is the word hear. I hear you. Oftentimes, and I know I did it as well, is I understand. And the reality is that my brain is so different. I don't understand. And sometimes I know we've had, I understand. No, you don't. Yes, I do. No, you don't. And so saying that I hear you is an acknowledgement and an invalidation, not invalid, an acknowledgement and a validation of the pain that she is sharing, not the understanding that I know how and what, but hearing how.
Yeah, absolutely. No excuses or blaming. This kind of ties to the recognition of ownership. But really hearing things like, you didn't cause this, it's not your fault. It's really important for a betrayed partner whenever possible to hear that. When those excuses, you haven't been enough here, you haven't been enough here, that can really penetrate into the heart of a betrayed partner, and it's not going to be helpful for the healing of the coupleship. It might kind of shuck some of the responsibility off, but overall, if you want your relationship to heal from the behavior, taking that and just saying it's not your fault, there's something within me, and maybe we do need to talk about our connection level. Maybe we do need to talk about our intimacy level and different levels or different types of intimacy. Lack of defensiveness, very, very important. We spent years, probably over a decade, with Kevin working on not defending. So saying, I choose not to be defensive even when I feel shame. So we're giving you a couple statements and prompts, like borrow these for a little bit until they become something that you can really believe. Write them down. But I choose not to be defensive. There's a choice in that. Even when I feel shame, because you felt a lot of shame for
a lot of shame, and that defensiveness, I think, is probably the number one thing that comes up for neurodiverse guys that I work with is defensiveness. Whether it's defensiveness from PDA, defensiveness from you don't understand me, defensiveness from I'm trying to just hear what I'm trying to say. Defensiveness is probably the number one, and on top of that, it's also probably one of the hardest for us as the neurodiverse to actually see when we're doing it. Because to us, it's logical. It makes sense what I'm telling you, and you're saying, but you're defending. And so that defensiveness is a huge one.
And you really wanted that autonomy of like thinking about it the way you need it. And so that, we can refer to PDA a couple different ways, but that autonomy was really, really strong for you. And so I think that just kind of created that cycle. So lack of defensiveness is very helpful. Willingness to hear feelings and anger. Ooh, big one. I put feeling/anger. It's not always anger, but it's often anger. And that's one of the first when there's been deception and things hidden, from a partner. I do want to hear you when you are upset. So when he could say that, now I needed to recognize how intense that anger was for him. And that was my responsibility to learn. And I'm telling you, it took me a long time to learn that, to not be explosive, to not shame him too. But if I wanted to be heard, my anger wasn't the problem. It was how I delivered my anger a lot of times. And then there were other times I was just angry. And I'm like, I'm so upset, I'm angry. And he couldn't hold that for 2 seconds. And so for him to learn how to say, I do want to hear when you're upset was really, really important.
Yeah.
So, all right. How do we overcome resistance? So if there's resistance in this and you're hearing this from the conference and you're going, well, that sounds great, but my partner's not there. That's great, you guys, that you got there, but what about for me? What does this mean? We would say, take it slowly. Okay. When there is resistance and we are pushing against that resistance, we are only going to get more. So I'm not saying it doesn't need a healthy level of push, but don't force characteristics and traits that have always been there. So, and the reason I say that is things like limited expressive communication, that is a trait. And when I said kind of that first part, the trait of limited expressive communication, Kevin has much less words than I do. And still, we're sharing this presentation, but really there are less words than I have to express. So when I would force that and say, why aren't you talking to me, right? Why aren't you doing that thing? Or why aren't you going to that meeting? Or, and I'm like pushing that, and there's a trait and I'm like, why aren't you responding? Now we got another injury on top of that. Take it slow if there's resistance. Share in those I statements. Say the things, gosh, this would really be important to me if you did this. This would really matter to me if you considered, looking at this problematic behavior. I think that approach would have worked a lot better for me. Remember, this will not be solved overnight. Oh man, this one was a big one because I think we hear it a lot. How quickly can we get through this? This is a problem. This is maybe even a crisis, but give space and time for healing. Find the right supports. You might need support on the betrayal, the betrayed partner side, or the struggling side, or the neurodiverse, coupleship side. So or all three. You might need a team. If this was a crisis medically, we'd get a team usually. So get professional support for both that betrayal trauma that are partner sensitive. And Kevin mentioned this at the intro, and it's in my bio. AppSats is the organization that is really partner sensitive to betrayal trauma. And there's a directory within the world actually that can support that. There's a lot of support for those struggling through different programs and organizations and CSATs, certified sex addiction therapists, even though it's not always addiction. And then the neurodiverse awareness. So that's a really important thing when we think about overcoming that resistance.
Awesome.
All right. So how do you focus on the relationship? State your needs. State your needs. And don't demand them, but share them. Let the struggling partner choose their path. Right. I wasn't going to force him. When I found out about the betrayal, he was ready to be done with that. Now, I'm not saying that's an always story, but he had been trying to stop this behavior for years. That's how we knew it was addictive in nature. He was trying to stop and couldn't. So state your needs. What do I need here? Establish written boundaries for safety and stability. Yeah. Written. Yep. I think that's so important. Maybe you get a whiteboard. We're fans of whiteboards. So you can see what are those boundaries. If you have an open phone policy where you can each look at each other's phone, I'm not saying you want to monitor it 24/7, but state that boundary so you're not arguing in it if, autonomy comes up or, dysregulation happens.
And that written boundary, I think, is so important when we add the neurodiversity component in there. I've talked to so many guys that have been like, well, I think she said something about, and I'm like, do you remember what she said? I don't. Then you need to go ask her again, and we need to write that down. We don't often remember boundaries very well because we don't want them, but we need to have a playbook that we can come back to. And that ties right into the considering the in-house or out-of-house separations. That too is a playbook. We work with couples and have documents and programs and plans in place for in-house and out-of-house separation, having it written, having it spelled out. That level of relational repair and restoration is not something that I had the capacity. Well, I had the capacity, but I didn't have the knowledge of how to do that. And I needed a playbook and a roadmap to do that. And so you've got to get a plan. And then I'm going to actually take the last bullet point as well, if I can.
And I will say also the separation agreement, the workshop that we did. So Mona, you have that available. So that is a great way to get that support. If you can't get, maybe there's financial constraints or other things and you just want to have some support. So we do have that workshop available and the document. So
then the last bullet point, I'm going to say this to the betrayed partner from the person who has done the betraying. If your struggling partner is not willing to support your healing in whatever that means, doing their work, helping you find your work and encouraging and supporting you in your work, then you need to focus on you and what you need to find health and to find healing and to find restoration for yourself. Yes, hopefully the relationship restoration will come as well. But you are worth pursuing that.
And a lot of times it doesn't.
Yeah.
Right. Kevin had some choices and there's a lot of people we know and a lot of people we work with, and it doesn't, the restoration doesn't have to be the goal. But getting healthy and knowing what you need is so, so important if that person is not willing to support you in your healing, because really that injury and that intimate deception of sorts has been caused, to you. And so saying, I am worth taking those steps for me too, even when the other person isn't willing.
Great.
So yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. So is there hope for recovery together? Yes. Yes. Many couples make it, like we said, some don't, but there is hope for this work. There is hope for getting the right support. And I see right, just, the best support for you when I say that. Again, it takes time and it takes work. Being patient. A lot of times in recovery circles, we'll hear things like consistency over time. It's been top of mind for me of what is that consistency? Because with Kevin's autism and those that have ADHD, consistency is a really hard thing. But him showing up and saying, well, I'm willing to hear you. I might not know how to communicate well right now. That's what I needed. And so that takes work and time. It's not going to be fixed. It's not, why are we still talking about this? It's, we're going to talk about this until we both don't need to talk about this, because the reality is no one wants to keep talking about this forever. There is support. And most times you need that support, especially after trying it on your own. We did it. It's much better with support. We promise. So any last thoughts?
No, I think that's it. Awesome.
All right. So last slide is let's strive, just a quote, let's strive for meaningful neurodiverse relationships as we accept and embrace our realities. So that was something we put together. It doesn't have a little footnote there, but let's strive for those meaningful neurodiverse relationships as we accept and embrace. If we have problematic sexual behavior, if we have other behaviors, you could probably insert a lot of things. Again, I briefly touched on financial deception. There's a lot of other things that can rupture, but let's strive for those meaningful relationships.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you for joining.
Thank you both. That was excellent. And I know it's going to be helpful to so many people to hear that you both have struggled and you've made it to the other side. Is your relationship perfect? No relationship is perfect, right? So, but you are now helping others. So for those who are interested in working with one or both of you, what is the best place for them to contact you?
I would say through our website. So it's livingstones.coaching.com. And there's a contact tab there. We do have the resources, some of them we've referred to, some of the workshops that we do. We do recovering couples neurodiverse workshops with groups so that you can be together with others when you have the complexity of both of these things intersecting. But also, printable PDFs and things like that. And you can find our schedules on there as well. So Kevin's mentoring isn't full-time. I've roped him into mentoring because it's so important. And then my coaching.
And then Mona, as thanks to you, we've ventured out into the podcast world a little bit.
That's right.
Because we did have people asking for some more podcast content. And so you can go on Spotify or Apple Podcast, and it's under Determined for More. And we have our workshop series. We have 6 sessions on there around the topics of our workshop. And maybe in the future, we'll be adding some more there. We'll see.
We'll see. He's kind of onto that a little sooner. And then the book Determined for More, that's where that comes from. So again, on Amazon, if you want to hear a full story, that is where that can be found, or other online bookstores.
Awesome. Fantastic. And then Shawna and Kevin and I did a workshop on healthy separation for neurodiverse couples. And you can find that on my website at neurodiverselove.com. Thank you both so much for being so vulnerable, for sharing a little bit of your story and how you've gotten to where you are. And thank you for being here at the conference. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been great. Bye.